A cold wind swept across the fjord, making the pine tops sway like scepters bowing in unison. Beneath the canopy, a circle of men and women stood around a stone altar, its surface slick with blood of freshly slaughtered goats. Torches flickered, casting grotesque shadows that danced with the sound of a lone drum. The priest, cloaked in bearskins, raised the ceremonial knife and cried out to Odin for victory for an upcoming raid. But before the chanting could crescendo, another sound cut through the night air. A faint, almost bell-like sound, like metal touching metal. It came from the neck of a man who had traveled, a trader who had arrived from distant lands, a small metal pendant gleaming at his chest, catching the firelight. It was not Thor's hammer. It was the symbol of an unknown god. It was a cross. The village fell silent, caught between their ancestral faith and a symbol from an unknown world. What could it mean? Could this foreign sign challenge their traditions or transform them into something new? Our story begins on the edge of this tension, where belief and bravery intersect, and where nothing is as simple as it seems. Welcome to a journey through time, myth, and faith. In this episode, we explore the transformation of a people renowned for their long ships and their ferociousness, into symbols of faith that preach strength, honor, peace, and humility. How did the men who once raided monasteries become the builder of cathedrals? How did Thor's hammer, wielded by warriors, turn into an entire country that took up a cross that represented sacrifice and redemption? We will dive into the richly textured world of Norse society, where the gods once walked among men, and battles decided the fate of souls. And then you'll hear how kings traded war hammers for baptism, and chieftains who fought bloody battles only to lay their swords at the altar, and of ordinary people whose lives were irrevocably changed by foreign influence and internal longing, and how that internal longing still exists in each of us. Along the way, we'll uncover surprising parallels between Nordic myths and the Christian narrative, showing how the values of courage, loyalty, and hospitality flowed from one worldview to another. We'll explore the idea that similarities in Norse culture and mythology are the very reason Christianity spread like wildfire through a dry forest at the end of a long summer. We'll also address the uncomfortable truth that Christianity demanded more than a superficial blending of symbols. It called for a wholehearted allegiance. By the end, you'll see this story isn't just about history, but about the human heart's capacity for change. The tension between tradition and transformation, and the timeless search for meaning. The last thing that we're going to explore is what very few scholars are willing to say, and that is Christianity in the Viking Age made these heroes of history better, more iconic, and far more endearing than they would have been without it. So sharpen your senses and your spirit. A saga awaits, one filled with blood, revelation, and the soft whispers of distant church bells. The stakes are as high as the cliffs of Norway, and the outcome will shape an entire civilization. Our tale begins with Henrik, a young man born of old beliefs. He grew up in a fjord carved deep in Norway's rugged coastline. His father, Gudmund, he was respected, a warrior who proudly bore the scars of many raids. The wooden longhouse they shared, it was adorned with carved dragons and runes invoking protection. As a child, Henrik was taught that honor lay in bravery and hospitality. His elders told tales of gods who rewarded valor and cunning. He learned to fish in icy waters, hunt in dense forests, and wield a sword with deadly precision. The taste of salt and iron, sea spray and blood mingled in his memories. One autumn, traders arrived. They had linen, fine jewels, and strange tales from the south. Among them was brother Anselm, a monk dressed in a simple brown robe, traveling under the protection of merchants. He spoke Norse, and his eyes were steady and kind. Around his neck, like the trader in our opening scene, hung a cross. The villagers viewed this pendant with suspicion, but not outright hostility. After all, hospitality demanded that guests be fed and sheltered before being questioned. Over mead and roasted salmon, Anselm spoke of a god who was not one among many, but the only one, and that he had come to earth as a man and had been executed on a cross. He had risen from the dead after 3 days. His words stirred unease and intrigue. Henrik scoffed quietly. What kind of god dies? But he listened. Winter came early that year. Snow piled high against the longhouse walls. The sky remained dark for long stretches of time. But by the hearth, stories were told, and Gudmund shared with Henrik about the upcoming raid on the monastery across the sea. They have gold, books, and men who can't fight. His eyes gleamed. The gods favor courage. We will take what we need and will return as heroes. Yet Anselm's stories lingered in Henrik's mind. He wondered why a warrior would kneel to a crucified man, why an enemy's god might be more powerful than his own. When spring arrived, Gudmund and his crew, they set sail. The sea was restless, its waves crushing against the dragonhead prow. In the longship, it approached the English coast. Henrik's heart thundered. They breached near a monastery. Bells tolled softly from stone towers in the distance. The monastery seemed small and vulnerable, yet there was a sense of peace that emanated from its walls. The raiders leapt ashore, axes raised. Monks fled like startled deer, and the Vikings seized chalices, altar clothes, and ornaments. One monk refused to run. He knelt before the altar, and he prayed. Gudmund scoffed and moved to strike him down, but as he raised his axe, a sharp crack of thunder rent the sky. A bolt of lightning hit a nearby tree, splitting it in two. Gudmund hesitated. In that second, Henrik saw fear flicker in his father's eyes. The thunderbolt's omen unsettled him. They returned to the ship. Gudmund mocked the monk's bravery, yet he couldn't shake off that thunderbolt's omen and what it meant. The plunder, it was plentiful, but something unseen had shifted. They returned home with treasure, but also unease. Henrik asked Anselm. He asked about the prayer of the monk that was about to die, and how he had peace in the midst of being attacked. Anselm answered, "Your gods crave blood, but mine teaches forgiveness and peace." Forgiveness seemed so weak to the Vikings, but there was power in the serenity that he had seen on the monk's face. Months passed, and Henrik's respect for Anselm grew. The monk had been in the town helping the injured, taught children to read using crude letters carved into wooden boards, and he never demanded payment. He spoke of a law that applied to all, even chieftains, and where kings also had to answer to God. Gudmund remained skeptical, mocking the crucified Christ and praising Odin for the success in their raid. He wore a hammer pendant, and he refused to touch the cross. His warlike life and scars from battle had turned these trophies into painful reminders of mortality. He began to drink heavily. One evening, word arrived that the Danish king, Harald Bluetooth, had carved a runestone declaring Denmark Christian. The comments were, "A stone doesn't change our gods." The elders and the townfolk murmured, yet they noticed that the Danish merchants now refused to trade unless their counterparts were marked with the sign of the cross. Certain markets even barred unbaptized traders. Henrik's friend Ragnar, even the strongest, most antagonistic to their gods and the new gods, he went to the river with Anselm and was baptized, but he didn't emerge in a white garment or a newfound eagerness to travel. He told Henrik, "It's just water and it's just words." They laughed. But you see, now I can trade in the market. Gudmund scowled at such an experience. We're not cattle to be marked for commerce. Our gods have never failed us. Henrik nodded, yet he noticed how many neighbors quietly took a cross in addition to their hammer amulets. They were just hedging their bets. No one was ready to abandon Thor, but neither did they wish to be locked out of the markets or alliances. The old ways, they remained. The new ways crept in like slow-moving fog. Henrik found himself standing at the edge of a world that was about to change. Late one night, a messenger arrived, breathless, at Gudmund's hall. "Olaf is gathering men," he shouted. "He means to take the throne. He is baptized, and he commands we destroy our temples." Fear spread like wildfire. Within days, Olaf's ships entered the fjord. They torched the small grove where Henrik had watched sacrifices. They hacked down idols and plunged them into the sea. Those who resisted were threatened with exile or death. Henrik saw an old priest weep as his carved gods floated away. In their place, Olaf's men erected a small wooden cross. "This is the true tree of life," Olaf's envoy declared. Gudmund bristled at desecration, yet he knew Olaf's army was too large to resist. Henrik felt anger and relief. Part of him burned at the desecration, yet he had witnessed violence committed in the gods' names, and he felt a pull towards something different. His world was definitely in flux. The story pauses here. At this moment, when a young man must decide which way he will walk, towards the thunderous gods of his father or towards the quiet power of the cross. In the weeks that followed, Henrik wrestled with competing loyalties. On one hand, he wore the hammer pendant his father had given him at the age of 13. It was a symbol of strength, a link to his ancestors. On the other hand, Anselm's words about mercy and truth, they resonated deeply. He occasionally touched the cross that hung around Ragnar's neck, and he wondered what it would be like to cast aside the hammer. He noticed neighbors who wore both symbols, and for a time he considered doing the same. Perhaps I can honor both. After all, the cross looked very similar to the hammer. But as he listened to Anselm's teaching, he understood that the new faith did not allow for half measures. The God I serve is a jealous God, jealous of false gods. Anselm explained all of this gently. He calls us to leave behind the idols of wood and stone. We can't serve two masters. We can't mix light and darkness. Those words struck Henrik just like the bolt of lightning at the monastery tree. They were both a challenge and a comfort. Part of him recoiled at the thought of renouncing cultural heritage. Another part of him sensed that truth demanded exclusivity. Gudmund, meanwhile, continued to mock the cross. He wore his hammer pendant proudly and whispered to Thor for good fortune. He saw the cross as weakness, but Henrik noticed his father's tremor. It was worsening. The once fearsome warrior winced when lifting heavy objects. He rarely spoke of Valhalla. In quiet moments, Henrik thought he saw a question in his father's eyes. Are our gods listening? Henrik wondered if Gudmund, too, felt the cracks appearing in the old worldview. One afternoon, Henrik sat with Anselm. They sat by the river. The monk carved letters into a wooden board, teaching Henrik to read simple words. Henrik asked, "Why can't I wear both?" Anselm looked up. "Do you believe both gods are true?" He countered. Henrik hesitated. "I believe the stories of Odin and Thor. They make sense to me, but I also see your God has power. The lightning, the peaceful monk, the way you love and serve the people in this community, all those things speak to me." Anselm smiled. "There can be only one truth, Henrik. If Christ rose from the dead, then he is Lord of all. That doesn't mean your ancestors were evil or foolish. It means they were searching. The old stories point to something greater. You must decide whether to accept that greater thing or hold on to a shadow. Henrik left the conversation troubled. He walked to the charred grove where the idols had been burned. He picked up a fragment of blackened wood and he threw it into the fjord. He watched it float away. He fingered his hammer pendant. He thought about the cross. He felt the weight of his father's expectation and the weight of truth. Could he renounce the old ways? If he did, would he be betraying his ancestors, or would he be fulfilling their deepest longing? The cliffhanger here is not whether he will embrace the new faith, but how he will wrestle with his conscience. Will he hedge his bets and wear both symbols? Or will he recognize that the true God requires exclusive devotion? As the waves lapped gently against the shore, Henrik knew his decision would have consequences, not just for himself, but for his community. The resolution of his struggle will unfold for us in the chapter to come. As Henrik stands at the crossroads, facing a world in flux, let's step back and explore the historical forces that shaped such moments. Understanding the broader context will illuminate why the pressure to mix symbols arose and why the call to renounce the old ways was so radical. To fully grasp the weight of Henrik's decision, we must leave the hearth and travel through the historical landscape of the North. The Viking Age dawned in the late 8th century, when sleek longships sliced through ocean swells and warriors from Scandinavia descended on European shores. Their religion was polytheistic, a tapestry of myths and ritual. Odin, the one-eyed wanderer, he was revered for wisdom in war. Thor, with his mighty hammer, protected warriors and farmers alike. Freya, goddess of love and battle, rode her chariot drawn by her cats. Their cosmology envisioned 9 realms connected by Yggdrasil, a mighty ash tree whose roots stretched into unknown depths and whose branches touched the heavens. Rituals took place outdoors at groves, lakes, or stone circles. Sacrifices, often animals, occasionally human, were made to secure victory, fertility, or prosperity. These rites reflected a worldview in which humans negotiated with the divine through gifts of blood and precious goods. From this worldview arose a set of values that later authors summarized as the 9 noble virtues: courage, truth, honor, fidelity, discipline, hospitality, self-reliance, industrialness, and perseverance. These values were drawn from poetry and the sagas. They taught that a person's word should be trustworthy, that loyalty to kin and lord was sacred, and that guests should be treated generously. Honor was paramount. Insults often resulted in feuds. Vengeance was not simply a personal choice, but an obligation to restore balance. This honor-bound ethos shaped social relations and underpinned the berserker fury of warriors on the battlefield. While the Norse gods were powerful and sometimes terrifying, they were not omnipotent. Ragnarok, the prophesied end of the world, hung over every myth like a storm cloud. Even gods would die in battle. The world would end in fire and ice, only to be reborn. This acceptance of inevitable doom created a fatalistic courage. Life was a struggle, but glory, it was earned through bravery and generosity. And not only that, but it could outlive your death. As the Vikings explored further and further, through raiding, trading, and settling in England, Iceland, France, and beyond, new influences seeped into their culture. Their first brush with Christianity came from the sharp side of a sword. Monasteries along the British coast, they were tempting. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793, it shocked Christendom. The abbey, it was filled with books, relics, and holy men that were unable to fight. It was pillaged, its wealth carried off by men who worshiped different gods. Chroniclers painted the raiders as wild pagans, as a scourge sent as punishment. To the Vikings, the monasteries were just another source of loot. And yet, as decades passed, relationships with Christian communities deepened. Vikings began to winter in foreign lands. They learned new languages and customs. They began to intermarry and produce children who straddled two worlds. Viking traders who wished to access markets in England and in Francia, they found it advantageous or even necessary to be marked with the sign of Christianity. Diplomatic marriages, cemented alliances, and baptisms became part of peace treaties. But by the early 10th century, the conversion of rulers became a political tool. When Harald Bluetooth of Denmark carved his runestone around 965, he proclaimed that he had made the Danes Christian. He was asserting both religious and political authority. To his neighbors and to his enemies, this signal meant that Denmark was joining the European Christian order. It opened doors to alliances and trade, but it also brought new obligations and oversight from powerful neighbors like the Holy Roman Empire. Similarly, Norway's kings used Christianity to consolidate power. The first churches that were introduced by the kings were met with resistance. Olaf used brutal methods, destroyed pagan temples, and forced baptism. And in many ways, his method backfired. But his successor, also named Olaf, later deemed a saint by the church, embedded the church in Norway's legal system. He built a network of bishops and turned conversions into law. Iceland lacked a king, but it took a different route. At their national assembly, the Althing, around the year 1000, chieftains debated for days, but they decided to adopt Christianity as the official religion. They also allowed for private worship of the old gods, so you could do both. This compromise avoided civil war, and it set a precedence for integrating Christianity without erasing heritage. In Sweden, pagan strongholds clung to their traditions much longer. The temples remained for quite some time, until eventually there was a king who became a Christian and dismantled these rituals and erected churches in their place. So by the early 12th century, Scandinavia was dotted with churches, and the conversion was largely complete. This historical overview reveals that the conversion of the North, it wasn't a sudden revival sparked by mass spiritual awakening. It was a complex process driven by political needs, personal strategy, and economic benefits, as well as cultural exchange. The old and the new, they often coexisted, sometimes uneasily, sometimes harmoniously. Understanding this complexity is essential to grasp the pressure that Henrik would have felt. Many around him would have worn hammer and cross, not out of devotion, but just out of prudence. Merchants didn't want to lose business. Chieftains, they hedged alliances. Yet those who truly embraced the gospel eventually realized that they couldn't serve two masters. Mixing was a practical compromise, not a theological resolution. The cross called for the end of sacrifices and the abandonment of idols. The Viking Age was poised between expedience and conviction, a tension we will see play out throughout the rest of this episode. Having surveyed the religious landscape and the political motivations behind conversion, we now turn to a subtle tale of mythic resonance and ethical overlap. Although Christianity demanded exclusive devotion, missionaries recognized that Norse myths contained echoes of the gospel. These echoes eased the psychological shift and allowed converts to see continuity rather than rupture. But even as these similarities were emphasized, the call to renounce the old ways remained clear. At first glance, the conversion of Scandinavia appears to be a story of brute force, kings imposing a foreign religion on their subjects, temples torched, idols smashed. But beneath the political maneuvering lies a subtle tale of resonance, an adaptation that defies a simple conquer and conquered narrative. Christian missionaries saw that the Norse were not mindless pagans, but people with a coherent cosmology. They drew on that cosmology to communicate the gospel. Yet they did not encourage mixing. Instead, they pointed to fulfillment. Consider the symbolism that missionaries would have employed. In the Norse imagination, the world was held together by Yggdrasil, a mighty tree whose roots stretched into the unknown depths and whose branches touched the heavens. Odin sacrificed himself on this tree. He hung there for 9 nights. He did it for himself to gain wisdom. When Christian missionaries sought to explain Christ, they drew parallels to Odin's self-sacrifice. Your God hung on the world tree, they would say. Mine hung on a cross. One gave himself for knowledge that he could use for himself. The other gave himself for knowledge that you could use to know him. Evidence is seen on runestones such as the one at Jelling. Christ is depicted entwined with vine-like patterns, reminiscent of a tree. To Norse eyes, this was not an alien image, but an echo of familiar cosmology. There are carved stones with crosses and scenes from Ragnarok, the death of the gods, and they're interwoven with the scenes from the Passion of Christ. The god Thor wrestles with the Midgard serpent on one side, and Christ triumphs over death and another serpent on the other. The message was clear. This new faith did not erase your myths, but it fulfilled their deepest hopes. Yet, missionaries also taught that Christ's sacrifice was the final one, rendering further offerings unnecessary. The story of Balder provided another bridge. His death by betrayal and his prophesied return at the end of Ragnarok, it was a native template for understanding Christ's death and resurrection. When Scandinavians heard of a god who died and returned, they didn't necessarily scoff. They remembered Balder, their beloved god who would return. Missionaries used this to explain Easter, but they also insisted that Christ had already triumphed over death, and that waiting for Balder, it was no longer necessary. The old myth was a shadow. The new story was the substance. Even the seasonal festivals aligned. Yule, celebrated at winter solstice, it involved feasting, evergreen trees, decorating, and hopes of the return of light. Missionaries, they didn't ban Yule, preach against it. Instead, they connected it with Christian meaning. They celebrated the birth of Jesus as the true light in the darkness, and they made other connections with Christianity. Balder's return resonated with Easter, the resurrection of Christ, and these connections, they eased the psychological shift. Converts could see continuity, and they could also see it in God's providence. Early preachers, they were careful. The festivals could continue, but the sacrifices, they had to stop. The songs could persist, but the content would change. Ethically, the Viking moral code, it shared considerable ground with Christian virtues. Courage, honor, hospitality, fidelity, they're all hallmarks of Norse culture. Christianity praised courage in martyrdom, honor in keeping vows, hospitality to strangers, and fidelity to God and to spouse. Acts of bravery were still celebrated, but they were now tempered by humility and mercy. Hospitality remained a sacred duty, expanded to include the poor and even your enemy at times. Discipline and perseverance continued to be admired, and now it was directed towards spiritual growth. When preachers spoke of turning the other cheek, Vikings didn't simply laugh. Many sagas already emphasized the wisdom of moderation and the folly of endless blood feuds. One of the greatest sagas, which predates official conversion, seeks arbitration instead of vengeance. While the saga is set before the official conversion of Scandinavia, its moral vision anticipates Christian ethics. Thus, the Christian message found fertile soil and acceptance in Norse culture because it already valued restraint and wisdom. Missionaries, therefore, they acknowledged that the old virtues were good but incomplete, and that they simply needed to be aligned with divine grace. Syncretism existed, but it was contested. Archaeologists have unearthed molds used to cast both hammer and cross pendants. Graves from the late 10th century sometimes contain both amulets. This is a testament to households hedging their bets and trying to mix and blend the two religions. Some sagas recount chieftains who accepted baptism to secure peace, then later sacrificed to Odin. This pluralistic phase, it eased the psychological transition, but Christian teachers didn't encourage dual allegiances. They insisted that baptism meant dying to the old self and rising to a new life. They denounced idols and urged converts to burn them. Over time, as the process of conversion unfolded, it became less about mixing and more about surrender. The cross called not for assimilation, but for transformation. In the decades after conversion, there was a tension between public allegiance to Christianity and private adherence to old rites. Some kings enforced baptism with violence, just like in the case of Olaf. He destroyed temples and forced conversions. Yet, even in such episodes, Norse agency persisted. Many who accepted baptism continued to raid. They raided, they fought, they explored. Rollo of Normandy accepted Christianity as part of a deal with the Frankish king Charles the Simple, yet he remained a war leader. Guthrum, defeated by Alfred the Great, agreed to be baptized and rule East Anglia under his new baptized name. They adopted their new faith for their political needs. However, for those who truly believed, the old gods faded. Over generations, sacrifices stopped. Human offerings, they ceased, and church bells replaced the drumbeat of rites. This little twist challenges any notion that conversion was purely a matter of politics or convenience. It shows that missionaries used cultural bridges to communicate truth, not just to encourage assimilation. But in reality, not all conversions were political. There were those who genuinely believed, and this twist challenges the notion that conversions were purely a matter of politics. It shows that missionaries use cultural bridges to communicate truth. They use similarities as signposts, pointing to fulfillment, pointing to the cross, pointing to the need for surrender of idols and the end of blood rites. It didn't ask Norsemen to forget their ancestors, but to see their stories as preparation for a greater narrative. As Henrik weighed his options, he was not choosing between equal gods. He was discerning whether the shadow he had inherited pointed to a light that demands his full allegiance. With this context in mind, let's return to Henrik's story, aware of his inner conflict and that it's a reflection of larger historical tensions. The part of this episode now was going to reveal Henrik as he wrestles with this call to renounce the old ways and embrace the new faith. We're going to see whether he wears both symbols or he discards one. We will explore the consequences of his choice for his family and for his community. This cliffhanger is going to invite you to consider, what would you do if your king commanded baptism at sword point? Would you cling to tradition or embrace truth, even if it meant being countercultural? The stage is set. Transformation that will resonate through generations. History often feels remote, yet the struggle between old and new, between heritage and conviction, it's universal, and it transcends time. We live in a world where change is constant and where multiple cultures converge. Like Henrik, we may be tempted to try to blend beliefs, hoping to please everyone and offend no one. We may wear the modern equivalent of both hammer and cross, thinking that we can hedge our bets. Yet truth, if it is truth, it demands a response, and it's exclusive. The Viking conversion story reminds us that courage sometimes means letting go of what is familiar to grasp what is real. It means recognizing that our ancestral stories, however noble, were quests for something greater. When the greater thing appears, bravery is not clinging to the old, but embracing the true. At the same time, the Christianization of the North, it shows that the old and the new are not as far apart as we might think. Norse myths about gods who sacrifice themselves and promise of renewal prepared the hearts for the gospel. Just as the moral virtues of courage, honor, and hospitality found fulfillment in Christ's teaching, The tension is not between good and evil cultures, but between incomplete stories and their completion. We all have a deep longing for truth. Sometimes it whispers in our myths, and it roars in our rituals. It calls us to search, question, and be willing to change. The brave embrace truth even when it means being countercultural, even when it means being misunderstood by family or mocked by neighbors and friends. Henrik's journey invites us to consider our own. Where do we see shadows of truth in our heritage? Are we willing to follow them to the source? In the next part of this episode, we'll see whether Henrik has the courage to lay down his hammer and take up the cross, or to stand by his ancestors and deny this newfound religion. For those who want to dig deeper, I would encourage you to reference these chronicles, these archaeological findings. Look at the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, read them, read the history of Lindisfarne, find out more about Harald Bluetooth. These sources will help ground you in history, in scholarship, and they will illuminate what the sagas were trying to say all along. So we pause here. There will be a part 2 to this episode, but I'm going to leave you with this. Be bold, be strong, and awaken the Viking in you.